The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air as the rain began to fall harder, the dark sky above threatening to unleash its fury. The only light came from the distant glow of the city, reflecting off the water in eerie ripples. The homeless girl stood there, frozen, staring at the billionaire and his unconscious child on the wet sand. Her heart raced in her chest as the weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just another person needing help. This was a man who seemed like he had everything: wealth, power, and a life most people could only dream of. But now, he was at the mercy of the ocean, just like her. With a burst of urgency, she dropped to her knees beside the man, her hands shaking as she checked for signs of life. His breath was shallow, and his face was pale from the cold. She looked down at the little girl, clutching her father's jacket with tears streaming down her face. "Help him," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. The girl hesitated for a second, her mind racing. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be alone in the world, but she couldn't leave them here. Not like this. Not in the storm. She reached into her pockets, pulling out a small, crumpled note that had been in her possession for weeks. It was from her grandmother. "Never leave anyone behind, not even in the hardest of times." The words echoed in her mind as she glanced back at the girl. The billionaire stirred slightly, groaning as his body began to react to the cold. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm now, as though speaking the words gave her the courage she needed. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she had to try. She turned the billionaire's face gently, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, confusion overtaking him for a moment before he focused on her. Are you?" he asked, his voice weak, barely above a whisper. "I'm just someone who can't leave you like this," she replied quickly, her voice breaking a little as she looked down at him. His eyes widened, scanning her face as though seeing her for the first time. "You saved us?" he managed to ask, disbelief in his voice. She nodded, quickly, moving to help him sit up, glancing at the girl who had managed to crawl over to them. She was small, no more than 5, her clothes drenched, her tiny body trembling with cold. The girl's lips parted as she reached for her father's hand. "Please, don't leave us," she whispered, and the weight of her words hit the girl like a physical blow. "I won't leave you," she said, almost instinctively. She hadn't meant to say it, but it felt true in that moment. She wasn't just helping a billionaire. She was helping a little girl who had no one else. She could feel the storm growing worse as the rain pounded against them. "We need to get you both out of here," the girl said urgently. She helped the billionaire to his feet, his weight heavy against her frail frame. The little girl clung to her side, not wanting to leave her father. The girl's heart pounded as she looked around, desperately trying to figure out what to do next. She didn't know what was going to happen after this, but one thing was clear: she couldn't let them down now. She had to make sure they were safe. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, but she wasn't going to let fear stop her. The sounds of the storm were deafening, but in that moment, all she could hear was the steady beat of her heart and the tiny whispers of a promise she had made long ago. A promise to help, to never turn her back on anyone who needed it. She glanced down at the billionaire, his face strained in pain but grateful. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice still shaky. She looked around at the dark, empty beach, the vastness of the world before her. "Anywhere but here," she said quietly, looking down at the little girl who was clinging to her jacket, trusting her like she had never trusted anyone before. With a deep breath, she lifted the child into her arms, and with the billionaire leaning heavily on her, they began the long walk to safety. Each step felt like an eternity, the cold water splashing against their legs as they trudged through the wet sand. The girl's muscles burned with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. Not when they were relying on her. Not when they had no one else. The storm raged on, but in that moment, as the girl walked towards the uncertain future, she knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had made a promise, and she was going to keep it. Together, they would survive this. She wouldn't let them down. The rain continued to fall as the homeless girl walked through the now empty streets, her worn shoes splashing through puddles. The weight of the billionaire's child in her arms was starting to take its toll, but she pushed forward, driven by the unspoken promise she had made. The man beside her stumbled, struggling to keep his balance as they made their way through the harsh weather. He had been silent for some time, still weak from the cold and the shock of the situation, but she could tell that he was beginning to come back to himself. As they walked, the little girl in her arms shifted restlessly, her small fingers clutching tighter to the girl's jacket. The billionaire glanced at her, his voice rough and filled with exhaustion. "Where are we going?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold air. She looked up, scanning the streets as the rain soaked through her thin coat. She had no plan, no idea where to take them, but she knew she couldn't leave them out here in the storm. "We just need to keep moving," she said softly, her words filled with a quiet determination. She didn't know where she was leading them, but it felt like it didn't matter. There was a strange sense of peace in knowing that she was doing something, that she wasn't just standing by while everything around her fell apart. The sound of the rain pounding against the pavement drowned out all other noises, but the girl's mind was racing. The billionaire, the little girl, none of them had anyone else. She had no idea how they ended up in this situation, but she knew that, somehow, they were all in this together now. A small voice broke her thoughts. "Will we be okay?" The little girl's voice trembled, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had fallen on her small shoulders. The girl looked down at the child in her arms, her heart aching with an emotion she didn't fully understand. "We'll be okay," she said, her voice steady, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She had never been sure about anything before, but this felt different. For the first time in a long time, she had a purpose. The billionaire's eyes shifted as he struggled to find the words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The girl shook her head, cutting him off. "You don't have to apologize. You're here now, and that's enough." He stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her fully. His expression was filled with something she hadn't expected, vulnerability. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly. The girl didn't answer at first. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't a hero, she was just someone who had been in the right place at the right time. But still, his words stuck with her, swirling around in her mind. She wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing, but the truth was, she didn't care. She couldn't just walk away. "We'll figure it out," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet strength. The rain continued to pour as they trudged through the streets, the sound of it filling their ears, but the silence between them was comfortable now. They had shared something in that moment, a connection that went beyond words. The billionaire looked down at the little girl in her arms, his eyes softening. "You're a good person," he said, almost to himself. The girl smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I'm not," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just someone trying to do the right thing." They kept walking, each step taking them farther from the chaos of the beach and closer to whatever the future held. She didn't know what was next, but she knew she would face it head on, because she had no other choice. There was no turning back now. The wind howled through the empty streets as the three of them made their way through the storm, but for the first time in a long time, the girl didn't feel alone. She had found something, someone, to fight for, and that made all the difference. The storm raged around them, but they kept moving, driven by the need for safety, for hope, for a future that was uncertain but somehow felt more possible than it had just hours ago. As they walked, the girl couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, something that had the potential to change everything. The light from the street lamps flickered dimly as the girl continued walking, her steps steady though the exhaustion was beginning to creep in. The billionaire, still weak from the shock, stumbled beside her, leaning heavily against her for support. His daughter, cradled gently in her arms, had fallen silent, her small face pale from the cold. The girl looked down at her, her heart aching. They had been through so much in such a short time, and yet, she could feel their trust in her, their reliance on her. She couldn't let them down now. The billionaire's voice broke the silence. "I should have been more careful," he muttered, his words thick with regret. The girl glanced over at him, noticing the guilt in his eyes. "No one expects a storm," she replied quietly, her voice firm but kind. "You did what you could. You're here now, and that's what matters." He met her gaze, the weight of his unspoken thoughts heavy in the air between them. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said softly, his voice shaking slightly. The girl smiled faintly, but the sadness in her heart lingered. "You're not alone," she said, almost to herself. "Not anymore." As they walked, the city lights in the distance grew brighter, signaling that they were approaching shelter, a warm place, a place where they might finally find some comfort after the chaos of the storm. The girl's thoughts raced. She had no idea what would happen after they found shelter, or what her future held now. She had never imagined that she would be in a situation like this, helping a billionaire, saving his child. It was like something out of a dream, but here she was, leading them through the cold night. When they reached the building, she stopped for a moment, taking in the unfamiliar sight of the towering structure. It felt out of place to her, like a world she didn't belong to, but for the moment, it was a safe place. She guided them through the doors, where a warm blast of air greeted them. The lights were soft, the lobby clean and polished, a stark contrast to the dark, stormy night outside. A concierge, an older man, looked up in surprise as they entered, his eyes briefly scanning the girl's worn clothes and the situation she was in. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone professional, but there was a hint of curiosity in his gaze. The billionaire straightened up slightly, taking a deep breath. "Yes, we need a room," he said, his voice still rough, but stronger now. The girl looked down at the little girl in her arms, who was still trembling, though her eyes were beginning to flutter open. "We're just looking for a place to stay," the girl added quietly, her voice almost apologetic, as if she didn't quite belong in this world. The concierge hesitated for a moment, but then his expression softened. He nodded and turned, typing something into the computer in front of him. "Of course, we have a few rooms available. I'll have one prepared for you." The girl nodded, but she could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She had kept them safe, gotten them out of the storm. But what now? What would happen next? The billionaire looked at her again, his face softening. "You saved our lives," he said, his words quiet, but filled with a depth of gratitude. She didn't know what to say. It wasn't about saving their lives. It was about doing what was right, about helping when no one else would. But hearing him say it made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Worth. "I didn't save anyone," she said softly, shaking her head. "I just did what needed to be done." They followed the concierge down a hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet building. The little girl, finally calming down, rested her head against the girl's shoulder, her small hand still clutching her jacket. When they reached the room, the concierge unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The warmth of the room was a sharp contrast to the cold outside, and for the first time in hours, the girl felt the weight in her chest begin to ease. The billionaire placed his daughter gently on the bed, sitting beside her as he glanced up at the girl. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with a sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. She nodded, not sure how to respond. She wasn't used to being thanked. She wasn't used to people seeing her. She looked down at the floor, suddenly aware of how dirty and tired she felt. "You're welcome," she said quietly, her voice a whisper in the still room. There was a moment of silence as they all stood there, the only sound the soft breathing of the little girl, now finally asleep. The girl felt a pang of sadness. She hadn't been able to help her own family, but here she was, saving someone else's. She had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like enough. She didn't know what was next for her, for them. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. The billionaire looked at her again, his eyes searching hers. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. The girl took a deep breath, her mind racing. "Now, we rest," she said simply. "We take a breath, and we figure out what comes next." She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't giving up on them. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, the soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. The girl sat in the chair beside the bed, watching the billionaire as he slept, his face peaceful for the first time since the storm. His daughter, still curled up under the covers, breathed in slow, steady rhythm, the weight of the night seeming to have finally lifted from her small body. The girl stood up quietly, stretching her stiff muscles. She was tired, too. Her body ached from the long night, the cold, the stress of the last 24 hours. But there was no time to rest now. She had to make sure they were okay. She had promised to help them, and she couldn't stop now. She moved to the window, looking out over the city, the streets still wet from the rain. The world felt different this morning, quieter, somehow. It was as though everything had shifted overnight, and now she was standing in the middle of it all, trying to figure out where to go. The sound of a soft groan broke her thoughts. The billionaire stirred, blinking his eyes open slowly. For a moment, he looked confused, disoriented, and then his gaze landed on her. "How long have I been asleep?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She turned back to him, offering a small smile. "A few hours. You needed the rest." He nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair as he sat up. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." She waved her hand dismissively, not sure how to respond. It felt strange to be thanked, like she didn't quite deserve it. "I'm just glad you're both safe," she said softly. He nodded, glancing at his daughter. "We owe you more than I can say," he murmured, his voice filled with emotion. "But we'll figure out a way to repay you. I'll make sure you're taken care of." She shook her head quickly, not wanting to hear any of that. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice firm. "I just did what needed to be done." He looked at her for a moment, his gaze searching, and then nodded. "Still, I can't leave this unacknowledged. You saved our lives." There was a long silence as the words hung in the air. The girl couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be here, that somehow, this moment was a turning point. She didn't know what was coming next, but she could feel that this was important. "Let me help," he said after a moment, his tone more determined. "I know I don't have much to offer right now, but I want to make sure you're taken care of." She hesitated, not sure what he meant. "I don't need anything," she said quickly. "I'm fine." But his expression softened, and he reached for his phone. "I'm not going to take no for an answer," he said. "I'm calling my assistant. We'll find you a place to stay. Make sure you have everything you need. You've done enough for us." She didn't want to argue. She had no place to go, no one to turn to. The thought of having a place, even for a short time, was tempting, but she didn't want to take advantage of his kindness. Still, she couldn't deny the relief that washed over her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worrying about where she would sleep tonight. She wasn't thinking about how to survive. She was just here, and it felt like a strange kind of peace. The billionaire spoke into the phone, arranging things with his assistant. She couldn't hear the details, but the tone of his voice was calm, professional. As he hung up, he turned to her with a small smile. "We'll have a car for you in an hour," he said. "It's the least I can do." She nodded, unsure of what to say. He stood up, stretching his back with a quiet groan. "I'll be right back," he said, heading for the bathroom. She stayed where she was, looking at the quiet room, feeling a strange sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. The billionaire had no reason to trust her, no reason to feel any kind of obligation toward her, and yet he was doing everything he could to make sure she was taken care of. It was hard to believe. It was hard to believe that people like him, people who had everything, would ever see her as anything more than just a stray, a nobody. And yet here they were. She wasn't sure what to make of it. But for now, all she could do was wait. She wasn't used to waiting for things, for good things to happen. Life had always been a struggle, and nothing had ever been handed to her. But this felt different. The billionaire returned a few minutes later, his expression more relaxed now, though his eyes still held that hint of uncertainty. "I'm going to take a shower," he said. "We'll be leaving soon." She nodded, watching as he disappeared into the bathroom. Her thoughts drifted back to the little girl. She had barely spoken since the storm, but now that the chaos was over, the girl was beginning to wake up. The girl glanced at the bed, where the little one had curled up under the covers. She felt a wave of protectiveness for her. This little girl, she had been through so much, and yet she was still here, still fighting. Just like her. The sound of the shower running in the background was a comforting rhythm, a reminder that things were slowly getting back to normal. The girl let out a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. A life where she didn't have to survive. On her own, where there was hope for a future. It was a thought she hadn't allowed herself to entertain in years. But now, standing in this quiet room, with a billionaire who had no reason to care for her, she couldn't help but wonder if things were finally starting to change. The car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness in the air. The girl sat in the back seat, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't seem to control. She was still trying to grasp the reality of what had happened. Just a day ago, she had been wandering the streets, surviving on whatever she could find, not expecting anything to change. Now, she was here, in a car with a billionaire and his daughter, heading toward a future that was still uncertain. The little girl in the front seat was quiet too, her eyes wide and still filled with the exhaustion from the storm, but she had her head resting against her father's arm, finding comfort in his presence. The billionaire sat beside her, glancing out the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. Every now and then, he would glance at the girl in the back seat through the rearview mirror, as though trying to gauge her reaction to all of this. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look back. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. What did you say to someone who had just saved your life? She had no answers. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to speak. Her thoughts were scattered, too many things fighting for attention at once. The storm, the rescue, the warmth of the hotel room. It was all a blur now. What did it all mean? She had never thought this would happen to her. People like the billionaire didn't notice people like her. They walked by, heads turned the other way. They never cared. But here he was, and here she was, sharing this space with him, with his daughter. It felt like something out of a dream. The car slowed, and she looked out the window to see a large building looming in front of them. It was different from anything she had ever seen. Grand, polished, towering over the city. She swallowed hard. This was it. This was where they were going. The car came to a stop in front of the entrance, and the driver opened the door for them. The girl hesitated, unsure if she was ready to step into this world, a world so far removed from the one she had known. The billionaire turned to her, his expression softening. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said quietly, almost like he was reassuring himself. "I know this is a lot, but we'll take it one step at a time." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. She didn't want to say anything. She wasn't sure if she could. She just followed him into the building, the heavy doors opening automatically, revealing a sleek, modern lobby. Everything was pristine, clean, and full of light. There were walls lined with art, floors made of marble, and a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a movie. The girl felt out of place, her worn shoes clicking against the marble floor, her clothes still damp from the rain. The billionaire turned to her, sensing her discomfort. "I know it's a lot," he said, his voice gentle. "But you're safe here. No one will hurt you." His words hit her like a wave. Safe. She hadn't felt safe in so long. Not since she could remember. The receptionist greeted them with a polite smile, her eyes lingering on the girl's clothes, but she didn't say anything. The billionaire spoke briefly to her, and within minutes, they were being escorted up to a suite. The girl couldn't help but feel small in the vast space around her. Everything was so perfect. The room they entered was huge, with large windows overlooking the city, soft, plush furniture, and a king-sized bed that seemed to promise rest. The little girl wasted no time in running over to the bed, her eyes lighting up as she jumped onto it, the comfort of it clearly a relief after the cold night. The billionaire stood by the door, watching his daughter with a fond expression. "I think she'll be okay now," he murmured. The girl turned to him, not sure what to say. She had been waiting for him to speak, but now that he had, it felt strange. It felt too real. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to take us in." He looked at her, his eyes soft, though there was still a trace of sadness in them. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he said quietly, "but I feel like I need to help. You saved us, and now I want to help you. No one should have to live the way you have." She opened her mouth to respond, but found that she couldn't find the words. She didn't need his help. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. But in that moment, she realized she was tired. She was so tired of fighting alone. The billionaire's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll figure this out," he said, more to himself than to her. "You don't have to worry about anything. You're safe here. We'll get you what you need." She didn't say anything else, her heart racing as she looked at the little girl, who was already fast asleep on the bed, curled up tightly in the blankets. The weight of the world seemed to settle into the girl's chest, but there was something else there too. Hope. For the first time, there was hope that things could be different. That maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The days that followed were quieter, filled with the soft hum of normal life that seemed so foreign to the girl. She had never known anything like this, and every moment felt like a dream. The billionaire, despite his wealth and power, was now a man who had seen vulnerability, who had seen what it was like to be truly lost. He had allowed her into his world, trusted her with his daughter, and for reasons she couldn't understand, he had taken responsibility for her, too. They ate together, sat together, and even began to talk, really talk. The small, awkward silences were starting to feel less uncomfortable. The little girl had adjusted to the change with the ease only a child could have, finding comfort in the warmth of the bed, in the new routine of breakfast and play. It was like she had never known hardship, and for a moment, the girl could forget the weight of the world pressing down on her. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The billionaire's behavior changed. He started to become more distant, his eyes often lost in thought, his mind elsewhere. He was still kind, still offering assistance, but there was a wall growing between them. She didn't know what had caused it, but she could feel it. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the tension was thick in the air. The billionaire had just finished a phone call, his face grim as he hung up the receiver. "Everything okay?" the girl asked, her voice quiet but probing. He looked at her for a moment, as though deciding whether to speak. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's complicated," he admitted, his tone laced with frustration. "I'm being pulled in too many directions. I've got a business to run, my daughter needs me, and now." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. She waited for him to continue, but the words never came. "I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable," he said after a pause. "I just don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I don't know what's best for you, for my daughter, for me." His voice faltered at the end, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the mask he wore so well. The girl felt a pang of sympathy. She had no answers for him. She didn't know what was best for her either. "You've done more than enough," she said softly. "You saved us, all of us. But, I understand. You don't owe me anything more." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers as if looking for some kind of reassurance. "I don't know how to repay you," he said quietly. "You're not just helping us. You've changed everything for me. For both of us." She felt the weight of his words, but she didn't know how to respond. She had never wanted anything from him, except for the chance to just exist without fear, without struggling to survive. "You don't need to repay me," she said firmly. "I didn't do this for anything in return." She could see the hesitation in his eyes, as if he was trying to understand her, trying to make sense of the situation. But before he could say anything more, the little girl appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice small. The billionaire immediately softened, his expression changing as he looked at his daughter. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired. But I'm okay." The little girl didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, walking over to where the girl was sitting. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. The girl smiled, reaching out to take the child's hand. "Of course," she said. The billionaire watched them for a moment, his gaze distant again. He was back to his quiet contemplation, the storm within him still raging, though now he kept it hidden behind a calm facade. The girl didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she couldn't help but wonder if things would always feel like this, on the edge of something bigger, something that was yet to be revealed. She wasn't sure where this road would lead them, but one thing was certain. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the weight of the world was on her shoulders alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days began to blur together, each one falling into the next. The girl continued to stay in the mansion with the billionaire and his daughter, though a part of her felt like an intruder in this world. She knew she didn't belong here, knew that sooner or later, she would have to face the reality of who she was, of where she came from. But for now, she pushed those thoughts away. She focused on the little moments, the sound of the little girl's laughter, the quiet dinners where they sat together as a family, the moments where the billionaire would open up, if only just a little. But as the days wore on, the girl noticed a change in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the billionaire who was distant now, it was everyone. The servants, the staff, even the little girl seemed to be more withdrawn, more unsure. It was as if a shadow had been cast over the house, and no one was talking about it. It was only when the billionaire came to her one evening, his face serious, that she realized something was about to change. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her heart quickening. "What's going on?" she asked, already bracing for whatever news he was about to deliver. "There are things I haven't told you," he said, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. "Things that affect all of us. And it's time you knew the truth." The weight of his words settled over her like a storm cloud, and she knew that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy. The billionaire's words hung in the air between them, his gaze intense, filled with a gravity that made her heart race. The girl sat silently, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, unsure of what to expect. She had spent so much of her life surviving, looking for any sign that she was seen, that she mattered. But this felt like something entirely different. "There are things you need to know," he said again, his voice low and steady. "Things that go beyond what's happened in the last few days. Things that might change everything for you, for us." She swallowed, her throat dry. She nodded slowly, trying to prepare herself for whatever he was about to reveal. The room was quiet except for the sound of her breathing and the soft hum of the air conditioning. The little girl, thankfully, was in the other room, giving them the space they needed. "I haven't been honest with you," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "About who I am, about my past, and about why you're really here." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. There was something about his tone, something about his vulnerability, that made her feel both terrified and curious. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting away from hers as if he were gathering his thoughts. "I'm not just a businessman," he began, his words slow but deliberate. "I've been part of something bigger, something much darker than just building an empire." He paused, as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear. The girl's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp now, trying to make sense of his words. He looked at her then, his eyes full of sorrow. "I've been involved in shady deals, illegal activities that I should have walked away from a long time ago. And they've caught up with me." She could feel her stomach tighten. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone who had so much, could be hiding something so dark. "But why tell me this?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Why now?" "Because," he said, his voice low, "you're in danger now. You and your family. They know about you, about what happened with me, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." The girl's heart pounded in her chest. "Who's after us?" she asked, the fear creeping into her voice now. He looked at her, his expression serious. "People I used to work with. Dangerous people. They'll do anything to protect their secrets." The room felt colder now, the weight of his words settling into her bones. "But you don't have to worry," he added quickly, sensing her panic. "I've been taking precautions. I've already made arrangements to keep you safe." She wasn't sure if she should believe him. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely. But something about the way he spoke, the sincerity in his eyes, made her think that maybe, just maybe, he was trying to protect her. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. This was more than she had ever expected. She had come into his world expecting nothing but hardship, and now, she was being told she was in danger, that her very life was at risk. "What kind of precautions?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He looked at her, his gaze filled with resolve. "I've already contacted my people. We're moving you to a secure location. Somewhere safe, where they can't find you, where you can't be hurt." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice softer now. "What happens to you?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering with a sadness she hadn't seen before. "I'm going to fix this," he said, his voice low. "I'm going to make things right. But I need to make sure you're safe first." The girl nodded, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. All she had ever wanted was to survive, to find a way out of the darkness she had been living in, and now she was in the midst of a storm that seemed impossible to escape. "I don't want to run anymore," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I don't want to be afraid all the time." The billionaire reached out then, his hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said quietly. "We'll protect you. I'll protect you." His words were like a balm to the wounds she had carried for so long. But she couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for that kind of promise. Could he really protect her? Could anyone? She didn't know. But she also knew she couldn't keep running forever. She had to trust someone. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to trust him. She took a deep breath, pushing her doubts to the back of her mind for the moment. "Okay," she said, her voice firm now. "I'll trust you." He smiled, the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "We'll get through this. Together." She nodded, still unsure of what the future held, but feeling a small spark of hope in the pit of her stomach. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The following days felt like a blur to the girl, the weight of everything still heavy in her chest. Despite the billionaire's promises to protect her, doubts lingered in her mind. The constant security, the guarded conversations, the strange glances from the people in the mansion, everything felt like a tightly wound coil, ready to snap. But as the days passed, the little girl seemed to adjust more easily than anyone else. She played in the garden, laughing and running with the new toys the billionaire had bought for her. The girl watched from the window, a bittersweet ache in her heart. The mansion felt like a dream that was too good to be true. She had never had anything like this before, never had a place where she felt safe enough to let her guard down. But there was always that lingering fear. The shadow of danger that the billionaire had spoken of still hung over them like a cloud, threatening to break apart everything they had built so far. One evening, after dinner, the billionaire called her into his study. She entered hesitantly, unsure of what was to come. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out over the city. There was a look of deep thought on his face. When he turned to face her, his eyes were hard, determined. "I've made some calls," he said, his voice low. "We need to move again. They found us." The girl felt her stomach drop. She had known this day was coming, but hearing it out loud still hit her like a punch to the gut. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people I told you about," he replied. "They've been tracking me for a while. They know about you now, too." She swallowed, her mind racing. She had feared this moment, feared that everything she had come to believe in would be torn apart in an instant. "What do we do?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We leave," he said, his tone firm. "I've made arrangements. A new location, a safe house. We'll be out of here by tomorrow morning." She nodded, though fear gripped her heart. "And what about you? What happens to you?" He hesitated for a moment, the weight of his decision heavy in the air between them. "I'll take care of it," he said finally. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, not after everything you've done for me. We're in this together." His words should have reassured her, but they didn't. There was something in his eyes, something that told her this wasn't just a matter of moving to a new place. This was bigger than that. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. But she didn't say anything. She just nodded again, the silence between them thick with unsaid words. The billionaire walked over to the desk, pulling out a folder from the drawer and placing it on the table in front of her. "This is the new plan," he said, his voice more businesslike now. "I've already set up everything. You'll be safe. No one will find us." She reached for the folder, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were maps, phone numbers, details about the safe house, and instructions for their escape. It was a clear plan, a foolproof one, but there was still that nagging feeling at the back of her mind. How could she trust him when everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers? "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. She looked up at him, startled. I don't know," she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. I want to believe you, but everything just feels wrong." He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to her, his eyes softening. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to trust me completely. Not yet. But I will do everything in my power to make sure you're safe. I promise you that." She searched his face, trying to read the sincerity in his words. For a moment, it felt like there was a connection between them, a shared understanding of everything that had happened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the fear, the constant uncertainty, made it hard to know what to do next. She closed the folder, her decision made. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll go with you. But I need to know that we're not just running forever. That this won't be our life." He nodded, his face filled with determination. "This will end. I won't let it go on for much longer. We'll get to a place where you won't have to be afraid anymore." She couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope at his words. For the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a chance for something better. She wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but it was the only one she could make right now. "All right," she said, standing up from the chair. "Let's go." He smiled at her, the weight of the moment still heavy but now tempered with a quiet resolve. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "We'll get through this. Together." As they left the study, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever came next would change everything. But she also knew one thing. For the first time, She wasn't walking into the unknown alone. The safe house was nothing like the mansion they had left behind. It was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the luxury and the eyes that had been watching them. The girl stepped inside first, the cold air of the night following her as the door clicked shut behind her. The space was simple, nothing extravagant, but there was warmth, and for the first time in days, she felt a tiny bit of peace settle in her chest. The billionaire stepped in behind her, looking around with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "It's not much, but it's secure," he said quietly, his voice almost distant. "It's all we need right now." The girl nodded, her eyes scanning the small living room. There was a sofa against the wall, a modest coffee table, and a few chairs. Everything felt so ordinary, so different from the world they had just come from. It was almost comforting in its simplicity. "This is fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "Thank you for getting us here." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "This is what we should have been doing from the beginning." She turned her gaze to the little girl, who was already making her way to the small bedroom at the back of the house. The child had hardly spoken since they had arrived, but she had finally seemed to relax, her little body sinking into the safety of a bed. The girl couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. She had been worried about how the child would handle the transition, but now, it seemed like things might actually be okay for them, at least for a while. "She's been through so much," the billionaire said quietly, following her gaze. "She deserves better than all of this." "Than me?" The girl didn't say anything at first. She wasn't sure how to respond. She could sense the guilt in his voice, the weight of his past decisions hanging heavy on him. "She'll be all right," the girl said finally. "You're here now, and that matters." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I've failed her so many times," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to make up for it." The girl reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "No one's perfect," she said softly. "But you're trying, and that matters more than you think." He looked at her then, his expression shifting, as if he were seeing her for the first time in a new light. She was right, of course. He had been trying, in his own way, to make up for the mistakes of the past, to fix what had been broken. But the guilt lingered, as it always did, gnawing at him. "I'll keep trying," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe. And you too." The girl didn't know what to say to that. She didn't need him to promise anything. She didn't need anything from him except the safety she had already been given. But she didn't say that. Instead, she nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We always do." The silence that followed was comfortable, if not a little tense. They both stood there, the weight of everything hanging in the air. And yet, despite the uncertainty of what was to come, she felt a small sense of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. The girl could feel it in the way the billionaire held his daughter's hand as they made their way into the small bedroom, in the way he had fought to get them here. He might not have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, it seemed like he was doing the right thing. She watched them disappear into the room, and then she turned away, letting out a slow breath. The world outside still felt uncertain, and there were still dangers they hadn't fully understood, but in that moment, the girl felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't known in years. They were safe here, for now. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days that followed were quiet, filled with small routines. The little girl adjusted to the new space, playing with the few toys they had brought along, her laughter filling the otherwise still air. The girl and the billionaire spent more time talking about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of silence, moments where the past threatened to take over. But there were also moments of peace, moments where they just existed, without the weight of the world pressing down on them. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the billionaire spoke again. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice serious. "There are still people looking for us. This isn't over." The girl's heart skipped a beat, the familiar anxiety creeping back. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rush of fear that was starting to swell inside her. He looked at her, his eyes dark but determined. "We stay here for now. We wait, and we plan. We'll get through this, together." She nodded, not sure what to expect. but understanding that they were in this for the long haul. For better or worse, they had come this far together, and she wasn't about to give up now. Not when there was still hope. Not when they were finally beginning to find their place in the world. The days in the safe house passed slowly, the once sharp tension in the air gradually settling into a quieter, more familiar rhythm. The girl had begun to feel more at ease, though the uncertainty never fully left her. She woke up every day to the sound of birds outside, the sunlight streaming through the small window, but her mind was always occupied with thoughts of the future. The billionaire, though still deeply affected by the weight of his past, had kept his promise. He had ensured their safety, and his daughter had started to smile more, the storm of the previous days finally easing from her face. Still, the girl could feel the subtle undercurrent of unease between them, the hidden burden of their pasts always lurking just beneath the surface. One afternoon, after they had finished lunch, the billionaire approached her again, his face more serious than usual. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She nodded, setting her cup down, a knot forming in her stomach. She had grown accustomed to the quiet moments between them, but the way he looked at her now made her uneasy. He took a deep breath before speaking again. "I've been digging into my past, trying to make sure we're as secure as possible," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a frustration that she hadn't seen before. "There's more to this than I thought, more than I ever wanted to believe." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. "The people I've been running from," he said, his tone darkening. "They've always been closer than I thought. They have eyes everywhere." She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Are they still after us?" she asked, her voice tight with the growing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. He looked at her, his expression heavy with regret. "Yes," he said simply. "But this time, I'm not going to hide. I'm going to confront them." The words hit her harder than she expected. "Confront them? How?" she asked, a lump forming in her throat. He paused, as if weighing his options, then shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I won't let them destroy us. I can't keep running forever." The girl remained silent for a long moment, processing his words. She had always known that this wouldn't be easy, but the idea of confronting the danger head-on terrified her. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took her hand then, his grip tight and reassuring. "I need you to trust me," he said softly. "I need you to believe that I'm doing this to protect us, to make sure we never have to live in fear again." She didn't know how to respond. Trust him? She wanted to. She wanted to believe that he was telling the truth, that he was strong enough to protect them. But the doubt that lingered in her mind was hard to silence. She had never been able to rely on anyone before. "I will do whatever it takes," he said, his voice resolute. "I just need you to stay safe. Stay here. I'll handle the rest." She nodded slowly, still unsure, but feeling a flicker of hope spark in her chest. It was the first time she had heard him speak with such determination. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "But please, promise me you'll be careful." He smiled then, a small but genuine smile, and squeezed her hand. "I promise," he said softly. "We'll get through this. Together." As the days passed, they all fell into a new routine. The little girl continued to play, her laughter now filling the house more often. The girl spent time with her, reading, drawing, doing whatever she could to keep her mind off the danger that still loomed over them. But every night, as they sat together, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. She didn't know how or when, but she could feel it coming. The billionaire kept to himself more often, working on something she didn't fully understand. He spent hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, his face drawn tight with concentration. And every time he hung up, there was a new sense of urgency in his steps, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him harder each day. One evening, after dinner, the girl was sitting on the couch, her hands resting in her lap, when the billionaire came in, his face pale. He didn't say anything at first, but she could see the worry etched in his features. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes dark and tired. "It's happening," he said, his voice low. "They know we're here. They're getting closer." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear. He paused, taking a deep breath. "We leave. Tonight." The words sent a chill through her, but she nodded, knowing that there was no other choice. The danger was real, and there was no running from it anymore. "We'll be ready," he said, moving toward the door. "Get the things you need. We're leaving everything behind." The girl stood up, her heart racing. She didn't know what awaited them, but she knew one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The car was packed quickly, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The girl moved swiftly, grabbing the few things she had managed to collect over the past days. Clothes, a few personal items she couldn't leave behind, and the small, frayed notebook her grandmother had given her years ago. She didn't know why she held on to it. It seemed to symbolize everything she had been running from, but it also represented everything she still wanted to hold on to. The billionaire stood by the door, his face tight with determination. He had already packed what he needed. His mind was clearly elsewhere, always focused on the danger that was drawing closer. The little girl clung to her father's side, looking up at him with wide eyes. She had no understanding of what was happening, but she could feel the tension in the air. "Are we really leaving, Daddy?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The billionaire's face softened as he knelt to her level, taking her small hands in his. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently. "But it's okay. We're going to be safe. I promise." The girl stood by, watching the scene unfold. She knew this wasn't easy for him. He had spent so much of his life in a world of control, and now he was being forced to abandon everything he had built to keep them safe. There was a sadness in his eyes as he looked at his daughter, but there was also a fierce protectiveness that she hadn't seen before. "We'll make it through this," he added, his voice steady, though she could hear the faint tremor of doubt beneath it. She nodded, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. She wasn't sure where they were going, or how long they could keep running. The road ahead felt endless, and yet, it seemed like the only option they had. She glanced around the house one last time, taking in the familiar surroundings, the soft lighting, the pictures on the walls, the space that had become their refuge, even if only for a short while. It wasn't much, but it had felt like home. "Are we ready?" the billionaire asked, his voice snapping her out of her thoughts. The girl gave a small, determined nod. "As ready as we'll ever be." The billionaire opened the door, and the cold air hit them immediately. The night had fallen, and the wind had picked up, making the streets feel even emptier than they had before. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. "We're not stopping until we're far enough away." The car ride was long and silent. The girl sat in the back seat, her eyes drifting between the dark road ahead and the little girl, who was staring out the window with a quiet expression. The billionaire was focused on the road, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. It was clear he was thinking, processing, strategizing, figuring out how to keep them safe. Every so often, he would glance at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering for a moment before he looked away. She wasn't sure what to say. There was so much left unsaid between them, and the more she thought about it, the harder it seemed to find the right words. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. The billionaire's eyes flicked to the mirror again, this time holding her gaze for a second longer. "Every day," he said quietly. "But it doesn't matter now. What matters is getting out of this. What matters is keeping you and her safe." The girl didn't know how to respond. She could feel the weight of his words, the responsibility that hung heavy in his voice. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the constant strain of trying to protect them, of trying to outrun the past. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease his burden, but she didn't have the words. "We'll make it through this," she said instead, her voice soft. "We have to." He nodded, though his jaw was clenched tight. "We will," he agreed, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. The car continued its journey through the night, the streets blurring past them as the girl sat back, lost in her thoughts. The future was still unclear, but one thing was certain. They couldn't go back. Whatever lay ahead, they would have to face it together. As the night stretched on, the girl couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. They were safe for now, but for how long? How much longer could they keep running from the dangers that haunted them? And when would it all catch up with them? The question gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. There was no point in worrying about what they couldn't control. For now, they had a chance, and she would hold on to that chance for as long as she could. The car finally pulled up to a secluded building, an unassuming structure that looked nothing like the towering mansions or sleek high-rises they had once been surrounded by. It was small, hidden, and unmarked, but it felt like the safest place they had been in weeks. The billionaire turned off the engine, glancing over at her. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "We're here." The girl took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was just the beginning, and she wasn't sure what would come next. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. The building was more than just a refuge. It was their lifeline, the first true sense of security they had felt in days. The girl stood in the doorway, the dim light casting long shadows across the narrow hallway. The air smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee, a far cry from the pristine walls and polished floors of the mansion they had left behind. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel out of place. She was here, in this new space, and for now, that was enough. The billionaire followed her in, looking around with a distant expression. His face was a mask of calm, but she could see the weight in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked nervously to the windows, the door, as if he was always listening for something. "It's not much," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "But it's safe. No one knows about this place." She nodded, trying to reassure him. "It's perfect," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. It was small, with a faded couch against the wall, a single lamp in the corner casting soft light across a worn rug. The kitchen was tucked in the back, and the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a place of luxury, but it was theirs now. "You did good," she added, her voice firm, as though she could reassure him with her words. "This is exactly what we need." He turned to look at her, his face softening for just a moment. "I hope it's enough," he said quietly. "I've been making calls. I don't know how long this will last, but it's the best I can do." She stepped closer to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It's enough for now," she said. He looked at her, his eyes filled with both gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know you didn't ask for this, but I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're here." She didn't know what to say to that. It was hard to hear, harder still to believe. She had spent so much of her life in survival mode, never expecting anyone to be there for her, never imagining that someone would care. But now, standing here with him, she realized that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "We'll figure it out. Together." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settled between two people who had learned, in their own way, how to trust each other. They were both carrying their own burdens, but for now, they didn't have to carry them alone. The little girl wandered into the room, her small face lighting up when she saw the sofa. "Is this our new home?" she asked innocently, her voice full of wonder. The billionaire smiled softly, crouching down to her level. "Yes," he said gently. "This is where we'll be safe for now. You can rest here, play, do whatever makes you happy." She ran over to the couch, jumping onto it with a grin, her excitement infectious. For a moment, the girl watched her, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was hard to imagine the kind of life the little girl had left behind, the uncertainty and the fear she must have carried with her. But here, in this small room, she was free to be a child again, at least for a little while. The billionaire stood, his gaze drifting toward the door. "I'm going to make sure everything is secure," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll be back soon." She nodded, watching him leave. She didn't know how much longer they could stay here, or what would happen next. But she did know one thing. For the first time, she felt like she had a purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for something. For the little girl, for the billionaire, for herself. She turned away from the door and walked to the couch where the little girl was now laying. Her small form curled up as she tried to make herself comfortable. "Do you want to draw something?" the girl asked gently, sitting down beside her. The little girl looked up, her eyes wide. "Can I?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Of course," the girl replied with a smile. "Let's make some pictures. Whatever you like." As they sat there, drawing and laughing, the girl realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead, she was finally starting to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time in years, she was building something. Not just a life, but a future. She wasn't sure how long it would last, But as she looked at the little girl's smiling face, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect that future. They didn't have all the answers, but together, they had a chance. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed felt like a delicate balance between normalcy and impending danger. The girl woke up each morning to the quiet hum of the safe house, the soft sound of birds outside, and the distant hum of traffic from the city. Life had slowed down in a way that felt almost unnatural, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The little girl had made the safe house feel like a home. Her laughter filled the room, the sound of her drawing or playing echoing in the small space. She was resilient, more so than the girl could have ever imagined. The billionaire had kept his word, securing the place as best he could. But despite his attempts to keep everything hidden, the girl could feel the tension in the air. The phone calls, the furtive glances, the meetings he would disappear to. They all pointed to something larger than they were willing to admit. One night, as they were sitting together in the small living room, the billionaire turned to her, his expression hardening. "It's getting worse," he said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "They know where we are. They're closer than I thought." The girl's heart sank as his words echoed in her mind. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but the dread in her chest was already rising. "It means that the time to hide is running out," he replied, his eyes filled with a determination she hadn't seen before. "We can't keep running. Not forever." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She knew it was only a matter of time before they had to face whatever was coming. The silence between them stretched, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the air thick with unspoken fear. The little girl, who had been sitting on the floor with her drawing pad, looked up, sensing the shift in the room. "Are we leaving?" she asked softly, her voice small and uncertain. The billionaire turned to her, his face softening as he crouched down beside her. "Not yet, sweetie," he said gently. "We're not going anywhere, but we need to be ready for whatever happens." She nodded, the confusion in her eyes replaced by a quiet understanding that only children seemed capable of. The girl watched them, the quiet exchange between them a reminder that they had become something of a family in this broken world. It was hard to believe they had gotten here, that they had made it this far. But with every passing day, she could feel something else growing within her, something stronger than fear. It was a bond, one forged through necessity, through survival. The billionaire turned back to her then, his expression soft but filled with resolve. "I'm going to make a move tonight," he said. "I need you to stay here, keep her safe. Don't open the door to anyone." The girl stared at him, unsure of what he meant. "What are you planning?" she asked. "I'm going to confront them," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not running anymore. I'm going to face what I've done. This ends tonight." The girl's breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure that's the right choice?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," he said, his tone final. "They won't stop. I have to end it, one way or another." She opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes told her everything. There was no changing his mind. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said instead, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. "I will," he said quietly, "and I promise we'll get through this. We have to." The tension in the room grew heavier as the night wore on. The girl stayed in the small living room with the little girl, trying to keep her calm, trying to reassure herself as much as the child. Time seemed to drag on, every passing minute stretching into an eternity. She kept glancing at the clock, the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. Finally, after what felt like hours, she heard the sound of the front door opening. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood up, her heart racing. The billionaire stood in the doorway, his face grim but determined. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're safe. For now." The girl didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. The danger was far from over, but they had made it through one more night. She nodded, her body exhausted but still on edge. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded in return, his face still carrying the weight of the decisions he had made. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I did what I had to do, but we're not out of the woods yet." The girl nodded again, her mind racing. She didn't know what the next days would bring, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. They had survived another night, but the storm was still out there, waiting. She took a deep breath, looking over at the little girl, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled up under a blanket. She didn't understand any of this, but she didn't need to. For now, she was safe. And that was enough. The girl walked over to the window, her gaze lingering on the darkened sky. They were safe, but she could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. She didn't know what was coming next, but she would face it. They all would. Together. The car ride was long, silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sound of the wind against the windows. The girl sat in the back seat, her eyes staring out the window as the city passed by in a blur. She had become accustomed to the constant uncertainty of their situation, but as they drove further into unfamiliar territory, a sense of foreboding began to creep in. The billionaire was focused on the road ahead, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The little girl sat beside him, her small hand resting in his, her eyes heavy with sleep. She had grown used to this new, strange life, but the girl could see the weight on the billionaire's shoulders. He was doing his best to stay calm, to keep them all safe, but she knew better than anyone that fear had a way of creeping in, even when you thought you were in control. They had left the safe house behind, driving through the night to reach a new location, one that the billionaire had promised would be even more secure. But the girl wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, how many more places they could hide before the people who were after them found them again. She turned her gaze back to the little girl, who had drifted into a peaceful sleep, her head resting on her father's shoulder. The sight of them, so fragile and innocent, made the girl's heart ache. It wasn't right that they had to live like this, constantly looking over their shoulders, always on the run. She wished she could do more, wished she could take away the fear that seemed to haunt them all. The billionaire glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned his focus back to the road. "We're almost there," he said quietly, his voice strained. "Just a little longer." She nodded, not sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. The hours passed in silence, the tension in the car palpable. It was as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving them in a bubble of uncertainty and fear. She could feel the weight of their future bearing down on them, but she couldn't bring herself to ask what would happen next. There was no way to know. They had no way of knowing how much longer they could keep running from the past, from the danger that was slowly closing in on them. As the car turned down a winding road, the trees on either side of them becoming thicker, more imposing, the girl's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the billionaire's voice. "We're here." They pulled up to a small, inconspicuous house, nestled at the end of the road, hidden from view by the thick woods surrounding it. It looked like a place no one would notice, a place where they could finally catch their breath. The girl looked at the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was their last chance. If this place was compromised, there would be nowhere left to run. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The billionaire nodded, his face hard with determination. "This is it," he said, turning off the engine. "We'll stay here until it's safe to move again. No one knows about this place." They got out of the car, the night air cold against their skin as they moved quickly into the house. It was small, modest, but it had everything they needed, a place to sleep, to hide, to stay out of sight for as long as they could. The girl followed the billionaire inside, glancing around at the dimly lit room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She could feel the exhaustion weighing down on her, but she didn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. She glanced at the little girl, who was already exploring the small living room, her excitement a welcome distraction from the heaviness in the air. "We're safe here," the billionaire said, as if trying to convince them all. "We'll be okay." But the girl could see the worry in his eyes, the cracks in his confidence. She knew he was just trying to keep the fear at bay, trying to protect them, but the truth was, they were far from safe. As the night wore on, the girl settled on the couch, the small space feeling more like a prison than a sanctuary. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that the danger was closer than they realized. She closed her eyes, trying to push the fear away, but it lingered, always there, a constant reminder that their safety was temporary. The billionaire sat in the chair across from her, his eyes fixed on the wall as he stared into the distance. The little girl had fallen asleep, curled up in the corner of the room. "We can't stay here forever," the girl said quietly, breaking the silence. The billionaire didn't respond at first, his eyes still focused on nothing in particular. Finally, he turned to her, his expression weary. I know, he said, his voice tight. But for now, we have to. We have to keep her safe. She nodded, knowing he was right. For now, they were safe. But she could feel the weight of the storm coming, the inevitable confrontation that would force them out into the open. She just didn't know when it would come or how they would survive it. She couldn't keep running forever. None of them could. She glanced at the little girl, asleep on the couch, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. She couldn't protect her forever, but she could protect her now, and that was enough. For now. The next few days felt like a blur, the walls of the safe house closing in as the girl tried to shake the feeling that danger was just around the corner. The tension in the air was palpable, and though the billionaire did his best to maintain a sense of calm, she could see the cracks in his composure. The little girl, still unaware of the full extent of their situation, continued to play and laugh, her innocence a stark contrast to the fear that lingered in the shadows. The girl found herself spending more time with her, trying to keep her distracted from the growing unease that filled the house. But the girl couldn't ignore it. Every day, she could feel the danger closing in, the people who were hunting them drawing nearer. There was no way to escape it. The billionaire had been making plans, contacting people, trying to secure their safety, but every conversation he had seemed to add another layer of worry to his already heavy burden. She could see it in the way he looked at her sometimes, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as though he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his promise. One evening, after dinner, he called her into the small office in the back of the house. The little girl was playing in the other room, her laughter echoing in the hallway. The girl stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She could tell by the look on his face that this conversation would be different. He was standing by the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's time to move." She froze, a cold chill running down her spine. "Move?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where? I thought we were staying here for a while." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "We can't stay here anymore," he said. "They found us. They're closer than we thought." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. "How do you know?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I've been watching the news," he replied, his tone tight with frustration. "There's been talk. People are starting to notice us." She felt a wave of panic rising in her chest. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers. "We leave tonight. We've got a place lined up, but we have to move quickly. It's the only option we have." She nodded, though her mind was racing. She knew this was coming, but the reality of it still hit her like a freight train. They had no choice but to keep moving, to keep running from the people who were hunting them. But the thought of leaving everything behind again, of never having a place to call home, filled her with dread. "How much time do we have?" she asked, trying to focus. He glanced at his watch. "Not long," he said. "We leave in the next hour." The urgency in his voice was enough to shake her from her thoughts. She knew what had to be done. "I'll pack," she said, turning to leave the room. "I'll be ready." He nodded, watching her go. "Make sure she's ready too," he said softly. The girl nodded again, her mind still racing, her stomach tight with fear. She found the little girl playing in the living room, her toys scattered around her. "Hey, sweetie," the girl said, kneeling down beside her. "We have to go, okay? We're going to a new place." The little girl looked up at her, her eyes wide with confusion. "Why? I like it here," she said, her voice small. The girl smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the little girl's face. "I know, honey, but sometimes we have to leave places behind to be safe. Don't worry. We'll be okay." The little girl didn't fully understand, but she trusted her, nodding and getting up to grab her things. The girl watched her for a moment, her heart aching. It wasn't fair that she had to grow up like this, never knowing peace, always on the run. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to go. The girl moved quickly, packing a few clothes and essentials, making sure they were ready to leave. She could hear the billionaire moving around in the other room, preparing to leave. She didn't want to think about what came next. She didn't want to think about the danger they were still facing, about the people who wanted to hurt them. All she could focus on was getting them out, keeping them safe. She grabbed her bag and walked toward the door, her heart heavy. "Are you ready?" she asked the little girl, who had finished packing her things. The little girl nodded, her small face serious. "Ready," she said. The girl opened the door, leading them out into the night. The car was waiting outside, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The billionaire was already in the front seat, his expression focused. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. The girl climbed into the back, the little girl beside her, and they drove off into the night. The road stretched out before them, endless and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, the girl felt a sense of determination rise within her. They weren't alone. They had each other, and together, they could face whatever came next. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, no matter what. The car's engine hummed steadily as they drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The girl sat in the back, her thoughts racing. The quiet moments in the car only heightened the feeling of unease she had been carrying since they left the safe house. The little girl had fallen asleep beside her, her small body curled up in the seat, exhausted from the whirlwind of the past few days. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and yet the weight of the situation, the dangers that still loomed over them, made everything feel so fragile. The billionaire sat in the front, his focus entirely on the road. The girl couldn't help but notice the tense set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like he was holding on to something he wasn't willing to let go. They had been driving for hours, and the fatigue was starting to show. Yet, even as exhaustion settled into his bones, he didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words, and it seemed like the miles between them only grew longer the further they went. The girl shifted in her seat, her eyes catching the rearview mirror every so often, catching glimpses of the billionaire's reflection. She wondered if he was thinking the same thing she was, about what would happen next. The little girl stirred slightly. In her sleep, her head resting against the seat, her small hand clutching the girl's jacket. The girl's heart ached when she looked at her. How could such a tiny person bear so much weight, so much fear? The life she should have had was ripped away in an instant, and now, they were all running, hiding from the very world that should have been protecting them. She sighed quietly, the fatigue of the night pressing down on her shoulders. She had never expected to be in a situation like this. She had always lived in survival mode, always alone, never truly trusting anyone. But now, here she was, riding in a car with a man who was doing everything he could to keep her and the little girl safe. And yet, she still couldn't shake the feeling that the moment they were growing comfortable in this strange new life, something would change. Something would happen that would shatter their fragile sense of security. The billionaire's voice broke the silence. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low but steady. She turned to look at him, his eyes focused on the road ahead, the darkness of the night surrounding them. "Where are we going?" she asked, the uncertainty in her voice betraying her calm exterior. He glanced at her quickly before returning his gaze to the road. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they won't find us." She didn't ask any more questions, not sure if she was ready to hear the answers. They had been running for so long that the idea of actually being safe, of not having to look over their shoulders every moment, seemed too far out of reach. The car slowed as they turned onto a secluded road, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. The trees that lined the road were thick, casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a brief moment, the girl thought they had entered some kind of forgotten place. She glanced out the window, trying to get a glimpse of where they were, but all she could see was more darkness, more trees, more uncertainty. The car stopped in front of a small, unremarkable house. It was tucked away, almost hidden by the thick woods surrounding it, but it was clear it was meant to blend in, to disappear into the landscape. The billionaire turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. The girl watched him, her heart beating faster. "Is this it?" she asked quietly, unsure of what to expect. He nodded. "This is it," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying the tension he was feeling. "We stay here for now. We wait for things to settle down." The girl nodded, though a part of her wondered if they would ever be able to settle. She couldn't imagine living like this forever, constantly on the move, never really putting down roots. It was exhausting, and as much as she tried to push it down, the fear was always there, lurking beneath the surface. The little girl stirred beside her, still half asleep. She rubbed her eyes, her small voice soft and groggy. "Where are we?" she asked. The girl smiled gently at her. "We're just stopping for a bit," she said, doing her best to reassure her. "We'll be safe here." The little girl nodded, though she still looked confused, her eyes flicking between the girl and the billionaire. "Okay," she said, curling back into her seat. The girl climbed out of the car first, her feet hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth surrounding her. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. She wasn't sure how much longer they could keep doing this, moving from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long, but she knew they had no other choice. She had to keep the little girl safe. She had to keep herself safe. The billionaire joined her, his steps heavy on the ground as he walked toward the door. He looked at her, his expression hard but his eyes filled with something softer, something vulnerable. "We're here," he said, as if it was an affirmation he needed for himself. The girl nodded and followed him inside, the house small but warm, a sense of peace settling over her for the first time in days. They weren't out of danger, she knew that. They weren't safe, not truly. But for now, this was their home. For now, it was enough. They could rest, even if only for a short while. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, her mind spinning with everything that had led them here. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running. She didn't know how long this fleeting peace would last. But she did know one thing. She wasn't going to let go of it. Not without a fight. The days in the small house seemed to blend together, a slow-moving current that carried them further away from the danger, but also deeper into uncertainty. The girl had settled into a routine, though it felt tenuous. She spent her days keeping the little girl entertained, trying to keep her in a sense of normalcy, while the billionaire worked tirelessly, making phone calls, checking in with contacts, and maintaining a watchful eye on their surroundings. He was always on edge, always alert, but he kept his fears hidden behind a calm demeanor. Every now and then, she could catch the briefest glimpse of the stress that weighed on him. The way his hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for his cup of coffee, the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. It was clear that the pressure was getting to him, but he said nothing. They were safe, for now. That was all he ever promised. But for the girl, safe didn't feel like enough. Every day, she waited for something, some sign that they had truly outrun the past. But that sign never came. Each knock on the door, every unexpected sound outside, made her tense, wondering if this was the moment they would be found again. It was a restless existence, one where the shadows of their old lives hung over them like a storm cloud. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the silence became unbearable. The little girl had gone to bed early, a habit she had developed since the chaos began. The girl was lost in thought, staring at the dimly lit walls, when the billionaire broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with something she couldn't place. She looked at him, her heart picking up its pace. There was a finality to his tone, a sense that whatever he had to say was going to change things. "What is it?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, as if he was trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about what happens when we're discovered. About what comes next." The girl stiffened, fear creeping up her spine. "What do you mean? I thought we were safe here." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "We can't keep running. I've been hiding for too long, and it's taking a toll on all of us. I can't do this anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The girl swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to confront them," he said, his words so final, so certain. "I'm not going to run anymore." The girl's heart stopped. "Confront them? Are you crazy?" She burst out, the fear in her voice rising. "They'll kill you." He stood up then, walking over to the window, his face set in determination. "I've been running for too long, but I can't live like this anymore. We can't keep hiding in fear. We need to face this, no matter what happens." "And what about us?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What happens to us if you do this?" He turned to look at her, his face softening just a little. "I'll make sure you're safe," he said, his voice full of a calm resolve. "You and her, you won't be caught in this. I'll handle it." She shook her head, her mind reeling. She had never seen him like this before, so resolute, so willing to risk everything. "You don't have to do this. We can leave again, move somewhere else. We can keep running." He walked toward her then, stopping just in front of her. "I've done that enough," he said softly. This is the only way to end it. It has to end. The girl looked at him, her heart torn. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, but this was something else entirely. The danger was real, and she knew that. But she didn't know if she was ready to lose him, to risk everything for a chance to face the people who had caused all of this in the first place. I can't lose you, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He looked at her then, his gaze softening. You won't lose me, he said, his voice steady. I'll protect you. I won't let anything happen to you or her. But she could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty hidden beneath his resolve. She didn't want to think about the consequences, didn't want to imagine what would happen if they were wrong. But deep down, she knew that this was the only way forward. They had to face the truth, whether they were ready or not. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I know, he replied softly. I'm scared too. But we have to do this. Together. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision settling between them. She didn't know if they would make it out of this alive. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing. They couldn't keep running forever. They had to take a stand, to fight for what they had left. And whatever happened, they would do it together. The night stretched on, and for the first time in a long time, the girl felt the first flickers of hope rise in her chest. They were facing the storm head-on, but at least they weren't facing it alone. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. The girl woke up to the sound of the little girl's soft breathing beside her, still curled up in a ball as she slept peacefully. The weight of the previous days pressed heavily on the girl's chest, her mind racing with the events that were about to unfold. The billionaire was already up, his silhouette visible through the crack in the door as he moved silently through the house. She knew he was preparing for whatever came next, whatever confrontation he had promised. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. The little girl had no idea what was coming. She still thought of this place as home, a sanctuary from the chaos that had turned their lives upside down. The girl, on the other hand, knew it was only temporary, a fragile illusion of safety. She sat up slowly, her legs dangling over the side of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. The silence in the house was deafening, and the uncertainty in the air seemed to hang like a thick fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that this calm moment was just the eye of the storm. She stood up, her legs shaky as she crossed the room to the window, peering through the blinds to see if anything had changed. The street outside was empty, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. It never did. She turned back to the bed, watching the little girl sleep for a moment longer before walking over to where the billionaire stood in the kitchen. He didn't look at her at first, his eyes focused on something far off. The weight of everything was still there, but there was something else now, a sense of resolve in his posture, in the way he moved. He was determined to face this head-on. We need to leave soon, he said, his voice low and controlled. She nodded, her heart pounding. Are you sure this is the right choice? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused, looking at her for a moment, his eyes dark with something unreadable. I don't know if it's the right choice, he admitted, his voice tight. But it's the only choice we have. She felt her throat tighten. What if it's not enough? What if we're not ready? He stepped closer to her, his presence commanding but gentle. We've been running for too long, he said, his voice steady. I'm not going to let fear control us anymore. She swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. His words were both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. She didn't know if they were ready either. The threat was real, and facing it head-on felt like walking into the unknown. She had no way of knowing if they would make it out of this alive, but she couldn't back down now. They had no other choice but to fight. We'll be ready, she said quietly, her voice firm. He nodded, his expression softening just slightly. I'm counting on you, he said. I'll take care of the rest. She couldn't tell him she wasn't sure. She couldn't tell him that she was afraid. Instead, she nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. They couldn't keep hiding forever. They had to face what was coming. The tension in the room was palpable as they finished their preparations, gathering what little they could carry with them. The little girl was still asleep, unaware of the impending danger. The girl sat beside her, brushing the hair from her forehead, her heart aching. How long could she protect her from this world? How much longer could they keep running from the truth? We're ready, the billionaire said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. She stood up, nodding. "Let's go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. They moved quickly, leaving the house behind with a mixture of sadness and relief. The girl looked back one last time as they stepped out the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. This was it. The final step in the journey they had started, the last chance to take control of their lives. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew they couldn't go back. They couldn't stay hidden any longer. The car was waiting outside, the engine idling. The night was dark and still, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The girl climbed into the back, the little girl following her, and the billionaire took his place in the driver's seat. The car began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as they left the familiar streets behind. She looked out the window, the landscape passing by in a blur, her mind racing. The billionaire's promise to protect them felt heavy in her chest, and she knew that they had to trust him now. There was no turning back. The night stretched on, the journey ahead uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the girl felt a glimmer of hope. They were taking control of their own fate, not running away from it anymore. The danger was still there, still lurking just out of sight, but they were no longer running from it. They were going to face it head on. And whatever happened next, they would do it together. The sun had barely risen when they arrived at the new place, a quiet, unassuming house hidden behind a thick line of trees. It was different from the last one, smaller, simpler, but it felt like a fresh start. The girl couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief as they pulled into the driveway, the weight of the journey finally starting to settle in her chest. The little girl, still groggy from the long ride, stirred beside her, blinking up at the house with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The billionaire sat quietly in the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings, ever vigilant. He wasn't taking any chances. They were still on edge, still running, but the fear that had gripped them seemed a little more distant now. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the new sense of hope that had quietly crept in. They were still alive. They were still together. And that meant everything. They stepped out of the car, the cool morning air refreshing after the long, tense drive. The girl looked at the house once more, taking in the peacefulness of the place, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed their lives. The quiet seemed almost unnatural, as though the world around them had paused, giving them this moment of peace. The billionaire turned to her, his voice low but filled with a quiet determination. "This is it," he said. "We can rest here for as long as we need." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could have a future here, away from everything that had been chasing them. But there was always that lingering feeling in the back of her mind, the fear that the danger wasn't truly gone. They couldn't outrun the past forever. Still, for now, this was enough. They had survived the worst, and they were going to build something better. "Let's get settled in," she said, trying to keep her voice light, masking the doubt that she still couldn't shake. The little girl tugged on her sleeve, her small hand gripping hers tightly. "Can we play here?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. The girl looked down at her, the innocence in her eyes reminding her why they had to keep going. "Of course we can," she said softly, squeezing her hand. "Let's make this our home." The billionaire smiled as he walked over to the front door, unlocking it, and stepping inside. It was a simple place, but it felt safe, and that was all that mattered. The girl followed him inside, the familiar feeling of the past few days returning, of moving, of running, but now with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt before. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax. They were safe for now, and for now, that was enough. They spent the rest of the morning unpacking, the girl organizing what little they had. It wasn't much, just a few bags of clothes, some essentials, but it was theirs. They made the best of it. The little girl, meanwhile, had claimed a corner of the room for herself, spreading out her things and making a small space to call her own. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. The girl could see the way the little one's eyes sparkled with a sense of joy that had been absent for so long. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that, in itself, was a triumph. The afternoon passed slowly. There was no urgency now, no rush to hide or to flee. For the first time in a long time, they had time. They had a moment of peace. The girl sat down beside the little girl, helping her put together a small puzzle she had found in one of the bags. They laughed together, the sound of their voices filling the small room. The billionaire watched them from across the room, his face softened by the sight of them, his daughter, safe and happy, and the girl who had kept them both alive. The girl's heart warmed at the sight of them. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way she had been before. They had become something more than just survivors. They had become a family, in their own way. The day faded into evening, and as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, the girl found herself sitting with the billionaire on the small porch outside. The cool air brushed against their skin as they watched the stars begin to appear overhead, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. "We've made it," he said softly, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, her eyes soft. "We've made it this far," she corrected him gently. "But we've still got a long way to go." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll keep going," he said with quiet resolve. "We'll keep fighting, no matter what." She nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. There were still so many unknowns ahead of them, so many dangers lurking in the shadows, but for now, in this moment, they were safe. Together, and that was all that mattered. The night stretched on, and the girl allowed herself to relax. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for once, she wasn't afraid of it. They were here, they were alive, and they were going to be okay.